The Book of the Middle Ages by Dorothy Mills. Part 1, The Early Middle Ages. Chapter 1, The Foundations of the Middle Ages. In AD 476, Rome fell, the Western Empire came to an end, and never again was there an emperor in Rome. Never again was Rome the seat of the government and of the Roman Empire. But what was it that had come to an end? Rome had given to the world justice, peace, and ordered government that deeply impressed itself upon the imagination, not only of those who dwelled within the empire and who were subject to it, not only of those who lived upon its borders and who came from the uncivilized land that lay beyond it, but also upon those who were to live centuries later. Since the beginning of recorded history, empires and civilizations have risen and fallen. Sometimes they would seem to have completely disappeared. It would probably be truer to say that the races who have developed the varying civilizations have disappeared, but that their gifts to the world have survived, not only in the form in which they gave them, but in the form in which the world has needed them. Rome herself owed to Greece all that was most worthwhile in the things of the higher intellectual life, and Greece had learned much from the earlier civilizations that had preceded her. And so, when the Western Roman Empire came to an end, it was the outward organization, the material things that gave way. The principles of honor and loyalty, of justice and order that had made Rome great were to endure. The immediate cause of the downfall of Rome was the invasion of the empire by the Germanic tribes from the north. Though these invaders were not as uncivilized as they have sometimes been painted, and though at the time of their invasions they were already learning much from the Romans, they were nevertheless not civilized as the Greeks and Romans understood civilization. But they were to play an important part in the making of the new world that was to grow out of the breakup of the Roman Empire. There was one other powerful influence at work in the Europe of the 5th century. Christianity had brought new ideals to the spirit of man. It had an influence and a power that transformed the lives of those who believed in it. And, as will be seen later, it was the Christian church that kept alive much of the priceless legacy of the ancient world, and that in time of disorder preserved the Roman ideals of law and discipline. Part 1, The Heritage from the Past. Rome had been profoundly influenced by Greece, but Greek civilization was first known in Western Europe in its Latin dress. And it was not until after 1,000 years from the fall of Rome that the springs of Greek thought and poetry, philosophy, and science were opened in any wide measure to the West. The immediate heritage of Europe came from Rome. She had ruled and civilized the lands that were to make part of the new Europe, and when the days of her might had passed, her imperishable gifts to the world were preserved. One of the most important factors in preserving Roman civilization was the Latin language. Latin had been common to all parts of the Western Empire, and throughout the period known as the Middle Ages, it was the language most widely used in Europe. It was the language of the church, of the universities, of all who were educated. And when, out of what had once been the Roman Empire, new nations arose, the peoples of those nations developed languages directly descended from Latin. Because Rome had once ruled in Italy, Gaul, and Spain, the Italian, French, and Spanish languages came into being. Rome had civilized the lands she had conquered, and the whole empire, north and south, east and west, was connected by great roads which served as channels along which her civilization passed. These roads were still some of the best in Europe, and in most cases, modern railways follow the same route. Rome also left the tradition of law and order and of a well-governed dominion. After the breakup of the empire, the church, in her organization, preserved this tradition, and Roman ideas of justice and order profoundly influenced the law of the growing states of Europe, and have never been lost to the world. In whatever direction we turn today, we find ourselves on a path made possible to us by Rome. Part 2, The Germanic Invaders of the Roman Empire. Footnote: the greater part of this section is taken from chapters 24 of my Book of the Ancient Romans. For nearly 500 years, Rome had kept her frontiers safe, and the barbarian tribes who lived beyond them had been unable to seriously threaten the Roman boundaries. But towards the end of the 4th century, these tribes began to push into the empire. Many reasons brought them. Their own lands, laying outside the empire, were poor, and the forests were not cleared. The swamps were not drained. They were subject to floods, drought, famine, and scarcity, and so the well-cultivated lands attracted them. Here's the picture of German auxiliaries. They came first for food and then for another plunder. They then began to value the order kept by the Roman government, and they made settlements and houses just within the Roman frontiers. As time went on, Germans began taking an active part in the life of the empire. They began to serve in the Roman armies, and in some cases even acted as officers. The latter were often men of great ability, and from serving in Roman armies they had learned Roman habits of military discipline and obedience. The Roman historian Tacitus has left us an account of some of these German tribes. He says, "They take pleasure in the size of their herds. These are their sole form of wealth, and they are very proud of them. Whether it is mercy or an anger that the gods have denied them silver and gold, I do not know, nor could I definitely assert that Germany produces no vein of gold or silver, for no one has explored. But they are not attracted in the same way that we are by its possession and use. The Germans fight with spears, which have a short, narrow head, but are so sharp and handy that they use the same weapon, as circumstances demand, for close and open fighting. The cavalry are content with shield and spear. The infantry also showers javelins. Each man carries several, and they can throw them a very long way. They fight naked or in a very light plaid. They have no elaborate apparel, and merely paint their shields with distinctive colors of the brightest hue. Their number is fixed. 100 come from each village, and they are known to their people as the 100. Thus what was at first a mere number has come to be an honorable name. The line is drawn up in wedged battalions. To retire from your post, provided you charge again, is thought to show prudence, not fear. They carry away their dead even after a doubtful battle. To lose your shield is the worst dishonor of all. One thus disgraced may not be present at a sacrifice or enter a council. After a defeat, many survivors have been known to hang themselves to end their infamy. When the fighting begins, it is shameful for a chief to be outdone in bravery, and equally shameful for the followers not to match the bravery of their chief. To survive one's chief and to return from battle is a foul disgrace which lasts as long as a life. When they are not fighting, they spend little time in hunting, much more in doing nothing. They devote themselves to sleeping and eating. Even the bravest and most warlike are quite idle, for they give over the care of the house and the fields to the women and the old men, and to all the weaklings of the household. They themselves merely lounge, for from the strange contradiction of character, they love idleness, yet hate peace. It is usually for the tribe, man by man, to contribute a voluntary gift of cattle or corn for the chiefs. They accept this as an honor, and it meets their needs. It is well known that none of the German tribes live in cities. They cannot endure undetached houses. Their houses are separate and scattered, pitched at the call of river, plain, or wood. They build villages, but not as we do, with buildings all adjoining and connected. Each man has an open space round his homestead, either as a protection against risk of fire or because they do not know how to build otherwise. The husband brings a dowry to his wife, not the wife to the husband. The parents come to the wedding and inspect the presents. These are not designed to please a woman's taste, nor can a young bride wear them in her hair. They are oxen, a bridled horse, or a shield with a spear and a sword. This is the dowry which wins a wife, and she in turn brings her husband some gifts of arms. A woman must not think herself exempt from thoughts of bravery or the chances of war. By the ceremony which begins her married life, she is warned that she comes to be her husband's partner in toil and in danger, to suffer and to dare with him alike in peace and war. This is plainly shown by the yoked oxen, the bridled horse, and the gift of arms. Thus she must live, and thus she must die. She is receiving a trust which she must keep worthily and hand on to her children, a trust which her sons' wives must receive in turn and pass on to their children. That was Tacitus, Germania. The earliest Germanic settlers in the Roman Empire had been the Goths. These were tribes who lived originally on the shores of the Baltic, but who had wandered south, the Visigoths settling on the shores of the Black Sea, and the Eastern Goths, or Ostrogoths, on the Danube. Emperor Aurelian, towards the end of the 3rd century, gave Dacia to the Visigoths, on the understanding that they would not cross the Danube or enter Roman territory. For nearly a century they lived there as friendly allies of the Romans, and were influenced by the habits and customs of their Roman neighbors. In the middle of the 4th century, the Visigoths in Dacia were so seriously threatened by a savage enemy coming from the east that they appealed to Rome for help. This enemy was a tribe of Asiatic people known as the Huns. They were so fierce and savage that it was thought that they were hardly human, and the very name of Hun terrified all who heard it. These Huns invaded Dacia and defeated the king of the Visigoths, who immediately sent an imploring message to the Roman Emperor, asking that the survivors, with the women and children, should be allowed to cross the Danube and come into the Roman Empire, where they hoped for protection. Valens, the emperor at the time, consented, and Roman officers were sent to see the proper protection was given to the Visigoths. However, the Romans plundered, robbed, and ill-treated the unfortunate Goths, so that those... Oh, here's the pictures. This is Aurelian. And there is Valens, or Valens, I don't know how to say it. And here is the Goths led into slavery. So that those who might have become firm friends and allies of the Romans became their deadly enemies. In 378, rebelling against the cruel and unjust treatment they had received, the Goths rose up in arms and in battle fought in Adrianople. They not only defeated the Roman army, but also slew the Roman emperor. Valens was succeeded by Theodosius, who wisely made peace with the Goths. He was known as the lover of peace and of the Goths, and as long as he lived, they gave Rome no trouble. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule over both the East and West. From the time of his death in 395, the East and the West, though nominally still one empire, each went its own way along a different path which led to a different future. Theodosius had kept peace with the Goths, but his successor was weak and hardly interested himself at all in the affairs of the empire. It was then that the Goths grew very powerful, and under a strong leader, Alaric, they ravaged the lands of the East and then entered Italy. Alaric wanted land for himself and his followers, but he does not seem to have been a willful destroyer for the sake of destroying, and he generally spared life if he received the submission of his enemies. He advanced in the walls of Rome and besieged the city. When the inhabitants sent out a messenger asking on what terms he would raise the siege, he agreed to depart if all their gold, silver, and movable property were sent out to him. "What will be left to us?" they asked. "Your lives," was the short answer. Some treasure was sent out to him, but it was not enough, and the siege continued. At length, in 410, Alaric entered Rome and allowed his followers to burn and pillage at will. A great deal of damage was done, though probably not as much as was supposed, and it is said that Alaric gave orders that the churches should be spared. Here's a picture of Theodosius and Alaric burning Rome. Although the days of her greatness had passed, the name of Rome was still one which stood to the world for all that was great and unconquerable. And when the news of the sack of Rome by Alaric spread to distant places, everyone was stupefied with horror and dismay. The news reached St. Jerome, who far off in his cell at Bethlehem was living the life of a hermit, and he could hardly believe what he heard. In a letter written shortly afterwards, he said, "The city, which had taken all the world, was itself taken. The Roman world is falling." As people began to recover from the shock, they asked themselves why such a disaster could have fallen upon Rome. There were still large numbers of pagans in the empire, and they blamed Christianity for the catastrophe. For the Christian religion, they said, had caused the neglect of the old Roman gods, who in their anger had allowed the city to fall. But St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, who was himself the son of a pagan father, but of a Christian mother, wrote a book called De Civitate Dei, or the City of God, in which he answered the pagan accusations, and in which he declared that Rome was of the world and therefore could not last, but the kingdom of God, as he called it, of the kingdom or city of God, was to triumph over the whole world, and this spiritual empire would endure. After taking Rome, Alaric left the city and soon made himself the master of Italy, and then he died. His name has become well known in history, not so much because he was himself a great man, but because he, a tall, fair-haired barbarian from without the empire, had broken the spell that had hung about the name of Rome. His followers buried him in a river, turning it aside from its course in order they might dig a grave in its bed. In it they placed the body of Alaric together with rich treasure, and then turned back the waters into their accustomed channel. And that none might ever know where his body had been laid, they put to death the men who had made the grave. Rome had been sacked, but she had not yet ceased to be the seat of government. The Goths withdrew from Italy and overran Spain, where they set up a Visigoth kingdom, which lasted early into the 6th century. Other tribes wandered about the Western Empire, and those who were most restless and destructive were the Vandals. At one time they lived near the Danube, and then through the south of Gaul they forced their way into Spain. The Goths drove them out of Spain, and they crossed to Africa, pillaging, ravaging, burning, destroying wherever they went. "Where are we going next?" a vandal once asked his chief. "Wherever there is a people with whom God is angry," was the answer. The Vandals seized the harbors of North Africa and built themselves ships in which they sailed like pirates over the Mediterranean, until in the middle of the 6th century they were subdued by the Eastern Emperor. But now the Huns again became troublesome, and under a powerful leader, Attila, they came plundering into Europe and reached Gaul. It is said that it was the boast of Attila that grass never grew again where the hoof of his horse had trod. He was known as the scourge of God, and he inspired such terror that the Romans and the Goths were willing to make friends in order to drive him away. In 451, their combined armies inflicted such a tremendous defeat on Attila at Chalon that all fear of the Hun dominion of Europe was dispelled. Attila left Gaul, but the next year he entered Italy and actually reached the neighborhood of Rome. The Bishop of Rome, Leo I, called the Great, went out of the city and fearlessly confronted the savage Hun. "Thus far shalt thou come, and no farther," Leo said to him, and demanded that he should immediately leave the land. Legend says that as he spoke, a vision of St. Peter and St. Paul, with their hands outstretched in blessing over the city, appeared in the sky, and that awed and terrified, Attila withdrew. He died soon after, and the Huns troubled Europe no more. Here's a picture of Attila. Other invading tribes were the Burgundians, who founded a kingdom in the valley of the Rhone, and the Lombards, who settled in the north of Italy. The Burgundians were not important as a kingdom, but they left their mark on the legend and poetry of Germany in the story known as Nibelungenlied. The Lombards settled in the valley of the Po, where they made Pavia their capital, and they also held scattered lands further south. The Lombards were less important for what they contributed to Italy than for what they hindered. They very soon broke up into a number of small states, all independent and jealous of each other, and their influence prevented Italy from becoming a united nation. The Visigoths had set up their kingdom in Spain, and other branch of the same tribe, the Eastern Goths or Ostrogoths, had settled north of the Danube. In 493, Theodoric became king of the Ostrogoths. As a young man, he had led them in attacks on the Balkan states of the empire, but the walls of Constantinople stopped his advance, and he was taken as a hostage to the imperial court. Alert, able, and ambitious, Theodoric learned a great deal at Constantinople. When he succeeded in returning to Italy and establishing himself as king of an Ostrogothic kingdom, he proved himself the ablest and best statesman of any of the Germanic leaders. He conquered all those who opposed him in the north of Italy, and then, making Ravenna his capital, ruled as a great king. He kept order in the land, he fostered the growth of cities, and spent a good deal of money in beautifying them with buildings inspired by Rome. He encouraged education and invited scholars to come to his court. Theodoric was tolerant and far-sighted. His kingdom included men of different races and religions, but he did not attempt to make them all subject to a uniform system of law. The Italians gave up 1/3 of their land to the Goths, but each race lived according to its own law and was allowed freedom to worship in its own way. Theodoric supported the Christian church, but he did not compel others to do so. "Religion," he said, "is a thing which a king cannot command, because no man can be compelled to believe against his will." Theodoric was the first king of the new Europe to recognize different nations living within their own clearly marked boundaries as equals. His reign was one of the first to foreshadow the new Europe that was to come, but at the end it was marred by an act of violence. The philosopher Boethius, who was living at his court, was suspected of being involved in a conspiracy to bring Italy under the emperor, and Theodoric had him put to death. Theodoric had ruled well and made the kingdom of the Ostrogoths strong, but after his death in 516, the rule of the Ostrogoths in Italy came to an end. Many of them were driven out by the emperor, and the remainder were ruled directly for him by a eunuch who lived at Ravenna. Of all these invading tribes, none survived except as a memory and a name, but the Franks, who invaded Gaul, and the Angles and the Saxons, who invaded Britain. They invaded, but unlike the other Germanic tribes, they stayed in the lands they conquered, and their story belongs to that of early France and England. Western Europe survived all these invasions. The Germanic tribes brought vigor and new blood into a civilization that was declining because the outward and material form seemed more important than the life and the ideals that had made it great. But however weak, the life and ideals were still there, and the tradition of finer things was never forgotten, so that out of the seeming confusion and disorder, there arose a new civilization, different, but not unworthy of that from which it had sprung. Here's a picture of the Gothic kingdoms, and you can see Italy and France and Africa and Croatia area.